Welcome. We're discussing the future of transatlantic relations as part of our Transatlantic Dialogues, which HCSS does together with the US Embassy in the Netherlands. And as part of these Transatlantic Dialogues, we've had a series of speakers to talk about the future of the transatlantic relationships, the future of US foreign policy, and basically the big issues that confront that relationship, primarily the rise of China and the increasing and intensifying competition in the Indo-Pacific. We're welcoming for this iteration of those transatlantic dialogues, we're welcoming Professor L Friedberg from Princeton University. He's a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University and co-director of Princeton's Center for International Security Studies. He's also counselor at the National Bureau of Asian Research, and in January 2022, he's appointed to a 2-year term on the Congressional U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. He has previously served in government and is the author of a series of books, both on U.S. foreign policy and grand strategy, on the history of British grand strategy, and on the U.S.-China competition. His latest book is Getting China Wrong, which came out in 2022. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
So, in your book, Getting China Wrong, you've basically looked at what the title says. How did we get China wrong? And as part of the Transatlantic Dialogues, one of our previous speakers was Jim Goldgeier, with whom I talked primarily about how did we get Russia wrong? Where did the relationship between the US and NATO, NATO on the one hand and Russia on the other hand go wrong? Where, in terms of that, 30 years ago, that moment of post-Cold War optimism, that sense that, we could have overcome these endless challenges, this endless competition, where did it go wrong, and why do we find ourselves in a situation that now, in many ways, looks like that looks like the Cold War again?
Well, the expectations were, at the end of the Cold War, early 1990s, that the ideological divisions that had characterized the previous 50 years had essentially come to an end, that the West, the United States, the other advanced industrial democracies had found the best solution to how to organize political and economic life, and it was only a matter of time before the last holdouts followed in that path, including Russia, parts of the former Soviet Empire, but also China as well. And there was a belief further that this process of transformation could be encouraged through what was referred to as engagement. So social, political, and above all, economic engagement between China and the United States, the other advanced industrial countries, would help to transform China and move it along this path. That first and foremost, China would become what was referred to in the early 2000s as a responsible stakeholder in the existing international order, so it would have an interest in supporting that order rather than trying to change it or overthrow it. As it became more and more integrated into the global economy, its own economy would move further and further towards a market-based, market-oriented economy like those of other countries like the United States and countries in Europe. And that in time, China's political system would also be transformed. It would move towards some form of more liberal system and a more democratic system. So those were very strong beliefs and expectations, and that's what underpinned the policies that were pursued in the West towards China, actually it started earlier, but certainly after the end of the Cold War. I think the simplest way of explaining what went wrong is that people in the West misunderstood the character of the Chinese Communist Party and underestimated its determination to remain in power, retain its grip on political power, and also retain control ultimately over China's economy, and also underestimated the extent to which China's leaders, as their country grew stronger, would begin to express and to pursue more revisionist aims. So we thought they were becoming just like us and they wanted nothing more than that. But the party, from the very beginning, had very different ideas.
And when you say revisionist aims, what are we referring to? What should the audience think of?
Well, first, I think, again, China's leaders, I believe this has been consistent over time, have always seen their country as the right, proper, dominant power in Eastern Eurasia. The United States had played that role after the Second World War, but from a Chinese perspective, the United States was an interloper, it didn't really belong, and its position depended on what the Chinese sometimes refer to as unequal treaties with countries like Japan and South Korea. And the belief was, the expectation, hope, I think, on the part of Chinese strategists was that over time, those alliances would diminish, the United States would eventually pull back from the Asia Pacific, and China would emerge as the dominant power. And in so doing, among other things, it would settle outstanding territorial issues as Beijing sees it, including taking control of Taiwan. I think what's become even more clear in the last decade, really under Xi Jinping, is that China's leaders also have global ambitions. It's not just their intent to reassert themselves as the dominant power in Eastern Eurasia, but ultimately to be equal to, if not superior to, the United States, for now the leading global power, in terms of economic capacities, technological sophistication, military strength, and political influence. I think that's the goal, and Xi Jinping now expresses it pretty openly. He says China is going to move towards center stage, and I think what that really means is we're going to be at least equal to the United States.
And I guess if we see China on this arc, we could also argue that this is the arc that any great power that grows follows. So why should we care if this is what all great powers do?
I'm not sure if all great powers do it in quite the same way, but yes, a power that's growing tends to have an expanding conception of its own interests. I think the root cause of the problem for the United States, for democratic countries in Europe and in Asia, again comes back to the character of the Chinese regime. It's one-party authoritarian dictatorship, which wants, I think, to reshape the world in various ways that, from the point of view of the party's leadership, will make the world safe for its perpetual rule of China. And so it wants to divide and weaken the democratic coalition of countries. It wants to see its view, for example, of conceptions of human rights, internet autonomy or sovereignty, and so on, adopted more widely. So it wants to change the world, including the democratic world, in ways that reflect its own interests and its own values. And I think that's where the problem lies, because those values are really inimical to those of liberal societies.
Right. Well, you made you made an allusion to making the world safe for democracy, making the world safe for its own brand of authoritarianism in China's case. So the way you just described it, that's essentially a challenge across a wide range of elements of statecraft. It truly would be a grand strategic challenge, where it's not just simply a matter of Taiwan and who controls Taiwanese territory, or any number of things that are fairly discrete and manageable, maybe, or at least solvable through more deterrence, more arms, less arms, whatever.
Right.
So what if that is the nature of the challenge, what would be the nature of the answer to that challenge?
Well, first and foremost, I think the democratic world has to gather its strength, be clearer about what the challenge is, and be prepared to oppose China's efforts to create that new world. And that is, I think, going to mean a number of things. One is reshaping our economic relationship with China, which we have allowed to evolve in ways that we now realize make us, again, democratic countries, dependent on China for a variety of materials and other products. And one thing that's come out of the Ukraine war, I think, is the recognition of how dangerous it can be to become dependent on an authoritarian regime that may become aggressive for critical materials. Or in the case of China, it's not just oil and energy, it's a whole range of things. So I think we're going to have to reshape the economic relationship, and that is starting to happen. We're also going to have to do more to maintain the advantages that democratic societies still have in a number of areas of technological development. because I think people have realized that China is determined to catapult itself to the top of the technological ladder at the expense of other countries and through a variety of means, including theft of intellectual property and so on, and that could have important both economic and strategic implications. So that's a second element of this. And also there is the military dimension. China has been, its economy has until very recently been growing very rapidly over the last 30 or 40 years, and that's enabled it to make enormous increases in its defense spending without really imposing a greater burden on the economy. When the economy was growing 10% a year, they could expand their military budget 10% a year and still not be breaking a sweat. And that's allowed them now to accumulate quite substantial and significant military power. And it's necessary for purposes of deterrence for democratic countries to strengthen their capacity for self-defense in order to deter aggression. I guess the last thing I'd mention is China has also been pursuing efforts to influence the societies of democratic countries, to take advantage of their openness to exert influence through various organizations, so-called United Front activities, through shaping the perceptions and the perceived interests of business interests, politicians, and that, I think, is something that now people are more aware of, and we need to be careful about allowing them to take advantage of our openness to shape our politics in ways that serve their interests but not our own.
Right. Well, and as you also referenced explicitly, on we had, as you said in your opening remarks, for a long time we had the assumption that if we kept trading with China, they would become more like us. In Europe, there was the expectation that if we would keep buying Russian oil and gas, that at some point they might not become more like us, but at least they would be deterred from taking any actions that were as risky as undermining as they did now. So the pendulum has swung from that kind of optimism of the 90s to a deep pessimism about that engagement with authoritarian regimes. That said, what do you see a tension between the de-risking or decoupling from the Chinese economy and at the same time, well, not creating a situation that is a self-fulfilling prophecy, that by cutting them off, there would be a growing sense in Beijing that this is a zero-sum game and they better go for a full confrontation because otherwise they will lose.
Right. Well, first I should say I don't think anyone in positions of responsibility, either in European countries or Asia or the United States, is advocating decoupling in the sense of completely disengaging economically. That could happen, but only in the context of a very severe crisis or confrontation. It is possible, just as it was possible with Russia. But I don't see anyone making the case that we need to do that or should do that. The second thing to say is that it's not entirely and exclusively up to us, and that in fact China has been pursuing a policy of de-risking, if you like it, for a couple of decades, which aims to reduce China's dependence on Western countries particularly for advanced technologies, but also for capital, and I think over time to reduce China's dependence on the markets of the advanced industrial democracies in order to reduce their own perceived vulnerability to the exercise of pressure by democratic countries against them, while at the same time, to the extent possible, maintaining the dependence of democratic countries on China for the array of critical products and materials I mentioned before. So they would like a lopsided relationship. It's not, it becomes less interdependence and more dependence, where it's more us dependent on them than vice versa. So this isn't entirely up to us, and I think the Chinese side has been driving in this direction for some time, and we are just becoming aware of that and just beginning to consider how we can need to respond. And we're at the early stages of discussion of that. I think there may be perhaps overly optimistic expectations in some quarters in the West about the limited extent to which it may be necessary to disengage. I think it's going to be difficult to do, and it's going to be difficult to keep it contained only to a few sectors.
Right. I think part of that de-risking strategy would, from the Chinese perspective, was also the Belt and Road Initiative, which of the immense risks they had to transport to and from China, which was mostly by water, by the maritime lines of communication, which they didn't really control at all. But talking, so maybe a few questions on to follow up. What would be the balance between continued economic exchanges with China and at the same time proper de-risking, so making sure that there's no real strategic vulnerabilities? How do we find that balance in between them? And I'm also asking that from the perspective of a European, where, as you know, European trade with China, with Asia writ large is massive. Dutch trade, Dutch investment, massive. So what is the balance between not letting China as an authoritarian regime capitalize on those dependencies and at the same time not, well, basically shooting ourselves in the foot?
Well, I think it has to start in the critical areas that are now being discussed and making sure that advanced industrial democracies don't become further dependent on China for a whole variety of materials and products. That's going to require a lot, and it's going to require steps to reduce the current dependence, for example, on rare earth minerals, which are essential to the green revolution, production of batteries, solar panels, and so on. So there's going to have to be a fair bit of expenditure, I think, to change that relationship, which we've allowed to develop when we weren't paying adequate attention to the political risks involved. So that's one thing. I think it's necessary also to limit the extent to which Chinese companies and entities can invest in or get access to an array of critical technologies. The United States, Netherlands, and a few other countries have started to do that with regard to high-end semiconductors, and there are going to be other sort of specific but fairly broad sectors in which it's necessary to reduce that. I think the biggest problem and perhaps the biggest question is the extent to which it is healthy or unhealthy for democratic societies to be as deeply engaged economically with China overall, aside from these critical areas, because it's clear that the fact that German automobile manufacturers hope to sell a lot of cars in China and other companies and other sectors in other countries are hopeful of their prospects still in the Chinese market, that does give the Chinese regime leverage that it can exert over Western governments to try to discourage them from doing a variety of things, including taking the measures that I just discussed to limit access to these critical technologies. So the very existence of that deep trading relationship does create potential vulnerabilities. As you suggest, one hopes that it also creates incentives on both sides not to disrupt that relationship. I think what we saw in the case of Russia and Ukraine, obviously it's a massive miscalculation, but I do think the expectation on the part of Mr. Putin was that he could do what he wanted to do in Ukraine, and the Western European or European governments and countries were so dependent on Russian energy that really in the end they wouldn't do anything that would risk that relationship. So it's possible for authoritarian leaders to miscalculate, and it's dangerous then to be in that position of extreme dependence. I guess overall I would say history doesn't provide a lot of reassurance that even deep economic interdependence between countries can prevent conflict between them. If there are overarching sort of strategic or ideological reasons for that, it's going to happen anyway, and that the outbreak of the First World War is an indication of that. So I don't think it would be a good thing, and again, coming back to where I started, I don't think anyone is advocating a total breakdown in that economic relationship, but we have to acknowledge that it's problematic in all of its dimensions, given the nature of the Chinese Communist Party regime.
Yeah, you just mentioned the First World War, and that is basically, I think, often is forgotten in the more optimistic outlook on the role of interdependence, that Britain and Germany were among each other's most important trading partners, and it didn't do much to prevent World War I. So, with all the points you've mentioned, I would like to move to what would be specifically the role for Europe. With all the points you've mentioned, that is primarily Europe's role in terms of preventing Chinese authoritarianism from having perhaps too great an influence. That emphasis is mostly on economic, political measures, basically using the EU's market power in both directions, both as a consumer and as a producer, to avoid dependencies, to prevent China from growing too quickly. When it comes to the Indo-Pacific, is there another role for Europe there? Is there a military role, or would the military role be better suited to ensure that NATO Europe is well protected and thereby give the US more maneuver space, perhaps?
First and foremost, I think it's the latter, that Europe needs to do more, and this has been true for some time, to take care of its own defense. Mm-hmm. And that's for a variety of reasons, not least under the current circumstances, to enable the United States to shift more of its scarce defense resources to the Asia or Indo-Pacific. So that's first and foremost. I do think that Europe has a role to play in Asia in attempting to deter conflict. And I think there's a growing recognition in European capitals that much as people in Europe might hope to be able to stay out of any conflict in the Indo-Pacific, and in particular, I think people are thinking now about possible conflict over Taiwan, in which the United States and China would be at odds. That in fact it isn't going to be possible to do that. That at a minimum, a conflict of that sort would have enormous economic repercussions, and even countries that weren't directly involved would be badly hurt, and therefore there's reason to want to do things, if possible, to try to prevent such a conflict. Right. And the best way of doing that, and I think this is where people seem to be going in the conversations that I've had with people in Europe, is towards thinking about how Europe can contribute to deterrence of aggression by China, and specifically the cutting edge now is in discussions of Taiwan. And there, I think the discussion seems to have stopped. Obvious sort of declarations that this would be a very bad thing. But I think the next question is, what exactly can European countries do to persuade China's leaders that if indeed they did use force, for example, over Taiwan, that they would face enormous economic costs. I don't think Europe has a great military role to play in the Indo-Pacific. Its resources are limited. It needs to concentrate closer to home, but it obviously has a considerable economic weight that it can put on the scale. But if we've learned anything from the recent experience, it seems to be that the mere threat or possibility of economic sanctions is not sufficient in itself to deter aggression. But the odds that Vladimir Putin could have been deterred or dissuaded from using force in Ukraine, it seems to me, would certainly have gone up if he could have been convinced that all of the things that we collectively have done in the economic domain to impose costs on him would happen if he did that. I don't think he believed it. Now he sees it. It didn't prevent this from happening. Perhaps it could have if it had been more clearly communicated. And I think that's a lesson that has to be applied in the Indo-Pacific. And my sense is that European governments, at least to this point, are reluctant to be seen talking about, for example, the imposition of economic sanctions, because they still are hesitant about taking positions that they think will offend China or provoke it in some way. But if you want to do whatever you can to prevent conflict, you have to be willing to make clear what you would do if conflict occurred nonetheless.
Right. Maybe, so as a final question, as you mentioned, the response by the US, Europe, key Asian allies to Russia's invasion of Ukraine came together with incredible speed, incredible comprehensiveness, right? Export controls, sanctions, the whole 9 yards. That could act, indeed, if this is communicated in advance, could act as a deterrent to China, to showing both capability, will, and communicating those through recent past. Yet at the same time, I guess from a European perspective, we could also point out that the Biden administration may have been uniquely positioned to do this, being probably President Biden being the most pro-Atlantic president in perhaps since the end of the Cold War, so a good 30 years. Yet, when it comes to the future of transatlantic relationship, we can also think of maybe a return of President Trump, or of those who would argue in kind of similar vein that the US should pull back, that the Europeans should take care of themselves, that the Europeans are free riders. So how do we balance between those elements, the competition between the competition with the authoritarian, potentially revisionist states, and also the uncertainty about our own populist, nationalist tendencies to pull back, or even sometimes sympathize outright with those authoritarian regimes? How do we find that balance in there?
Well, there are many things in that question. So I would start by saying that, at least in my opinion, any intelligent assessment of America's strategic interests and of the current challenges to those interests posed by China and Russia, China in particular, requires closer cooperation with our like-minded partners and allies. I don't see how we can successfully deal with that challenge, if it's as big as we say it is, without that cooperation. So then the question is, well, how to achieve that, and what forms does it take? Again, my own opinion is that pulling out of Europe, as some people have effectively argued over the last several years, although now there's been some backing away from that, would not serve that purpose, that in fact it would be harmful to our efforts to deter aggression in the Indo-Pacific, as well as deterring aggression in Europe. So there's a need for closer cooperation. But, or as part of that, I think there's also a need for a new assessment of what the relative distribution of the costs of doing this should be. And the Trump administration, or the advocates of the Trump policies, would say that yes, there was a lot of bluster and threat and so on, but really the purpose was to get the Europeans to spend more money on defense. And look, it actually happened. I'm a little skeptical that that was the reason why, or that that was the best way to do it. But I do think that desire for Europe to play a greater part is held across party lines. And that's going to be a persistent issue in transatlantic relations, just as it was at various points in the Cold War, the arguments about burden sharing. So it hasn't gone away. It's true that there is present in American politics now kind of isolationist strain. It's not unique to this historical period. Those sentiments have ebbed and flowed. They're probably stronger now, at least in some quarters, than they've been in a few decades. I don't think they're the dominant point of view. If you look at public opinion polls, I think that reinforces the sense that a majority of Americans still see it as being in U.S. interest to have close allies, to participate in helping those allies to defend themselves. But there's also a desire for allies to do more and to do what they can to help defend themselves and help us collectively defend ourselves. And there's a sense that in Europe, many countries, in fact, have not done that. The shock of the Russian invasion seems to have encouraged a number of countries to at least make the commitment to, for example, to live up to their NATO commitment of 2% GDP, or to fulfill that commitment. I'm thinking here particularly of Germany. And that's a good thing because of the capabilities that it should enable Germany to produce and contribute to European defense. It's also a good thing if you're concerned about future tensions in transatlantic relations, if you're concerned about pressures on the American side to pull back. One way of fending that off is to make clear that you're doing more to contribute yourself to your own defense. It's a good thing in and of itself. It's a good thing for transatlantic relations.
All right. Thank you for that comprehensive answer to what is a set of questions with a lot of moving parts that are all now moving very, very rapidly. So thank you, audience, for joining us. This was another take on U.S. foreign policy and which we're trying to do with the Transatlantic Dialogues to present a wide variety of perspectives on the ends and means of the U.S. foreign policy and how that will impact the relationship with Europe, specifically in light of the growing challenge from China. Thank you.